Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the opening and closing plenary for the day. This is the session that was supposed to be first thing in the morning. And first of all, I want to thank everybody for your flexibility and understanding today with the newest challenge to a scenarios forum. We haven't had this one before. So thank you very much for that. I also want to note that it is the summer solstice, so the longest day of the year, or the shortest day of the year for you in the southern hemisphere. For those of you who are Christian, you know that this means there's 186 days before Christmas, so good time to start your shopping. We are talking about scenarios after all, so we do long-term planning. Seriously, we have a very, very interesting plenary this evening. You can see it's changed from what's in the program. We're going to have 3 speakers for the price of 2. The first speaker is going to be Casper Koch, and then we're going to have Julia Leninger. And without further ado, Casper, would you like to take it away?
And I get it, my presentation will come. There you go. Well, good evening. So when I said yesterday night, finalizing my presentation, I made a scenario of today. And then the first wild card came by and the second wild card, and now we are in the evening, and I'm very happy I'm getting the chance to be here. That does mean one thing. It means what I was going to present yesterday. So what I thought of presenting when I made this presentation yesterday, and I didn't change it anymore because I gave the presentation this morning, had 2 very detailed examples with methodological, interesting consequences. And I already see most of the faces here, you're not up to that anymore. So I am going to race you through the 2 points that are the background and concepts that by now, certainly by the end of this day, you're well familiar with, so there's not much I have to say about that. And I'm going to be really short on the illustrative examples, mostly because I do want to spend quite some time on the regional community wishes, so that's the last bullet point. Now, I always talk too much, so I'll probably only have 5 minutes for that anyway, but we'll see. This you know, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, we have 5 shared socioeconomic pathways. And they come in 3 pieces, at least originally. So these things come in narratives, they come in tables that kind of have elements of interest and then trends across all the 5 SSPs. I like those because you can kind of compare the SSPs quite rapidly. And then of course there is the SSP database that offers a range of quantitative information related to SSPs. So these are usually also regional level, the kind of products that we work with. Narrative tables, data. Just to make sure we're all on the same page. I stole all these slides, they're not even mine. I don't know who's copywriting this one, probably somewhere sitting in the room. But what I want to make sure we all understand that the basic SSP is a P. It's a pathway. Not the right word, and I'll show that later, while regional people don't like the word pathway for these things, but it's not a scenario. It's something basic, and a basic thing that kind of, has just enough information to place it in part of the uncertainty space with the challenges of mitigation and adaptation. And these things need to be extended to become scenarios. And they can be globally extended, so you can make the pathways more detailed, the scenarios more detailed, the narrative more detailed, the tables more detailed. You can do sectoral modeling. These can all be mostly global extensions. And loads of them have happened, and loads of them you've seen over the past 2 days. What I'm going to talk about is only the regional extension, so it's a sub-global level. Struggle a lot with that word. For me, anything that's not global is regional, so it could be 20 countries, it could also be a sub-watershed. All fine with me. And if you look across everything that people have done in downscaling and sometimes also upscaling, that's why I say cross-scale, linking the SSPs, there's basically 3 mechanisms you see in literature. One is, and that's almost a classical one, even though there's others also there, is you take the global narratives and you make regional versions of those. You actually downscale the text. And those regional stories then can go into the same process as the global ones would, feeding regional models that then would give you regional impacts. Okay? Second one is the most simple one. You take a global database, there's information about countries, you have a country study, you take those data, you plug them into national models, and that gives you a downscaled version of the SSPs as well. And the third one, this is the one that surprised us when we did our systematic review that I'll tell you about in a second, is when you look at the SSP applications, you see those that actually take the SSP database. They use numbers directly from the database, they plug them into their models, they run the models, but then they use the models to derive narrative extensions based on the model results. And that's sometimes just a simple discussion in a paper, but sometimes they're so elaborate that they actually do become extensions of the narratives. It's a small subset, but really interesting. One thing you should, of course, never forget is when we do regional studies, almost always the people, our own clients and stakeholders we interact with, always want integrated scenarios. So we always have to look at the matrix of SSPs and RCPs and pick a few combinations that are relevant for the study at hand. And I'll come back to this matrix later. I know this figure is slightly outdated, but I'll have a few more things to say about it in the wish list. So, what you are aware of is that there are systematic reviews going on, trying to make sense of all the SSP literature out there. And Carol was here yesterday, and she was in a parallel session earlier today explaining about the IIASA initiative. Roughly 1,600 papers, and I think it's 2,600 hours of coding. And to make the math a little bit easier for you, I rounded all those numbers, so it's 1,600 for the iconics, and we have a second review paper, also based on a systematic review that has 160, so roughly 10%. And we focused that review on those SSPs that are not global and those that have an explicit narrative component. I won't want to say a lot about it, but only these numbers already reach me two conclusions. First one being that 90% of the paper, this is not a majority, this is almost all, of the papers that use the SSPs are global and are quantitative. But it also tells me that even if it's only 10% that's left over, we're still talking about 160, and we're not picking up everything in the peer-reviewed literature. There's easy hundreds of examples of those that regionally extend the SSPs and they use a narrative component. So it's quite a potent database of quite a lot of papers that actually do that. So a few figures from a preliminary analysis of that database. So here's the 160 papers, and they are now coded by main sector they cover. And so I think this is probably more diverse than what the global database is showing. But the main sector present is only 18%. And then you quickly go down to below 10. So it's such a broad variety. I mean, nothing new there. I mean, regional studies do become more diverse, and it really convincingly shows that there is such an enormous diversity of people that have picked up on the SSPs in non-global level and quickly expanding. Something else we had a lot of fun with looking at is which SSPs are actually being selected when you do this non-global study. So quite some are obedient, 35% does all of them, but that does mean that 2/3 doesn't. So they make some kind of choice to drop one or more of the SSPs that are available to them. And you see that if you do 4, you either drop number 2 or you drop number 4. SSP4 and SSP2 are dropped in the 4 SSP variants. And then if you look at the 3, then by far the most popular one is SSP123. So that's the old SSPs, very often because they also did SRES studies, and they like more the ones that they can actually directly link to existing SRES-derived studies. Perhaps more interesting, if you look at the individual SSPs and how much they've been used, you see that 2, perhaps 3 stick out. So it's SSP1, 3, and 5. Are above or 80% or 90% of the cases uses those. And then it goes down to 70% for SSP2, and it goes down to about 50% for SSP4. So 2 conclusions from that. The SSP1, SSP3 pair is almost always there. So this is kind of dystopian, utopian pair that is very easy to explain to most stakeholders at non-global level as what they represent, and therefore I think are almost always in the set. And clearly SSP4 is very underrepresented. Reasons for that later. And this is just to show you what kind of downscaling mechanisms we found in terms of percentages. So what you see, and that's not surprising at all, is that almost all the studies did some kind of downscaling. Now, they started from the global SSP, so that's not a surprise that they actually downscaled something. But also that about half of them, so 46%, include some kind of bottom-up, some kind of stakeholder process, and that local knowledge was then trickled up to some higher level of the SSP scenarios. Right, from here I'm going to go more fast. So these are just some examples of papers that have done downscaling, and I'm just showing them to you because they're all different. So this is an approach where they actually started from the table. So these were people that came to me and said, we don't want narratives. Can we go directly for those tables with pluses and minuses, because that's much easier for us. So they developed a method to do that. They have very short stories in the end, but it's really never been the focus of the study. Here's another approach which was very much stakeholder-led, but they started with models. So they first looked at their own regional models that they had available to them. From that, they derived key model inputs, and then they kind of told the stakeholders to populate databases with those parameter values, but at the same time also generating stories to go with it. But they really started from the models to actually populate the models later on. And then in the same vein, you can also say, well, forget about the models at all, let's only do narratives. So there's a few very strong studies that actually only aimed at making new narratives. This particular case, I myself did the European SSPs as a narrative paper, and that was taken along by Hermine Mitter and others, and they actually developed SSPs for the agricultural sector. But only the narratives, even though they're now being used in models, this paper is really only on the narratives. Right, I told somebody I cannot say something about regional scenarios without saying impressions at some point, because this has been a project in which we learned so much about how to downscale SSPs. So this was an EC-funded project. We worked on high-end scenarios, so mostly RCP 6 and above. We had a really high degree of stakeholder participation. We had 4 SSPs, and I think what I see in the database a little bit is the effect of the Impressions project for not having SSP2. Because we didn't like it in this project, and there's quite some papers that actually deal with that. We did narratives and models as a European integrated assessment platform that we use as integrated model. Can't say a lot more about it. Go to the highendsolutions.eu page, and you'll find all kinds of information on this project that already finalized. What I want to show a little bit is if you only do narrative downscaling, and I'm not going to explain this figure, I just want to point to you that there are all these different arrows between different types of narratives, and they all mean different things. And it can be extending and contextualizing and influencing and downscaling, and they all meant different things to us. So even if you go from story to story, there's a lot of decisions to make. How to actually then make those stories, and how consistent they have to be between scales, and there's a lot of decisions you actually have to take. By the way, more information you want, the coordinator was Paula Harrison, and she can tell you all about it. So what it allows you to, I just want to show 2 slides quickly. Why would you? I always have this argument, why would you downscale SSPs and have SSP consistent stories over multiple case studies? Well, I say you can, because it allows you to compare. Because now what I can do now is I can put all the case studies together, Europe, Scotland, Iberia, Hungary, Central Asia, and I can look across different elements, and I can start seeing how those have been interpreted in the storylines of the given case studies. And it gives you a lot of power to actually scale back up. Because downscaling is not really the problem, it's upscaling that is the problem. All the local diversity that remains diverse is not something that global modelers will ever be able to use. So the SSP mechanism to create consistency is something very strong. And so you can compare model output, which of course has been done. You've seen many studies where SSPs, and you show the models and how they integrate. What we've done here is to actually compare the stories. So not just take those narratives to be something that can lead to model input. No, it's a product in its own right. But then, so what this shows here is the stories in the different SSPs across the different case studies. And what we did is we coded the text according to the cultural theory of worldviews. So there are hierarchists, you can barely read it in the bottom there, hierarchists, egalitarians, individualists, and fatalists kind of worldviews. And we started coding the text in order to be able to see to what extent local studies matched the actual global starting point. And what you see mostly from this overview is that it becomes more a mix. So where global stories, look at SSP5, it's 100% yellow. And if you look at the SSP5 for Hungary, you will see that there's almost an even split between the 4 different worldviews. So that's definitely a different type of story than what the global one is telling. Other word I want to mention, I worked with integration. And we say integrated scenarios. And the more I talked about it, the less I understood what it was. If I go to the next slide first, integration is not so easy. Integration is easy if you have a model. Okay, so here's, in this case, for impressions, it was the integrated assessment platform. It could be any model that calls itself integrating. And you put in the loose elements of socioeconomic change and of in this case, RCP information went into it. And then magically, out comes integrated impacts. So somewhere along the line in this black box of the model, the integration happens. But it's still difficult to say what is really happening. And the same happens if you do pathways. In this case, pathways means normative scenarios, how to reach certain goals. Also there, you have the pathways themselves magically integrating. And I'm still not quite sure what integration is, actually. But I won't talk about that right now. Another very often used way to use the SSPs is actually not... So what I always say, SSPs are useless in most of the cases that I work with. I tell a policymaker, give me €1 million and I will tell you what the future is. And I come back and I tell the same decision makers, well, the future, that depends. That depends which SSP you're in. And now I know for sure that it really depends. And so that's usually only half the story. So what you need is to use those 4 SSPs as kind of ways to look through to the future at a same common vision, and then try to use those to see which elements of pathway constructions, of policies work across those different SSPs. And from that, make a robustness check. I'm going to skip a few of those slides, otherwise I'll talk too much about it. Just to highlight that pathways for regional scenario developers, these are pathways. They're commonly shared visions. From that, you do a backcasting exercise which builds you a pathway towards certain elements of that solution. So they're totally confused when I talk about representative concentration pathways or socioeconomic pathways, because there are different things to that community. But in the end, what it allows you to do, I can't talk about the wildcards, unfortunately. I'll skip it. But what in the end it allows you to do is to make these kind of tables where you put the scenarios, in this case in the columns, and you put the elements of your pathways on the rows, and you start checking how well they fare across the different scenarios. And what you're looking for are those rows that are all green, because those are sometimes ridiculously different scenarios that cover the entire uncertainty space. Would work in all of those different scenarios. And you could really tell people, I'm going to focus on those elements, because that's what you need to, irrespective of what SSP exists and how plausible you think it is, how realistic you think it is. Those are things that are still useful to help you. Right, and Elmar is not here either, so he can't tell you about this, at least not in person, but he was the coordinator of that project where this stuff came from. Very short summary on that. So what I found really remarkable, well, maybe not so much given all the people that are here in the room, but people really use the SSPs. And not only in the climate change community, not only in this community, in a wild variety of communities. So I learned a lot from people that I didn't know before that are actually doing really interesting stuff at regional level with the SSPs. So many and increasingly more. And the common scenarios that we have in this database now of 160 papers really allow us to do cross-comparison, and the potential for upscaling is really there. I mean, we haven't scratched the surface of what we can do with these 2 databases that we have now. But of course, the whole group of studies, certainly the sub-global one, is extremely heterogeneous. The diversity I don't have to stress, of course, there's local diversity. But what you also see importantly is that there are common characteristics. So methodologically, I find it very interesting that of the 160 studies that we included, I think 140 use some kind of co-production method. So the direct engagement of stakeholders in the process of developing scenarios is super common. And the other thing that I then also need to stress, because then otherwise people see me as some qualitative story developer, but of those 160 studies, also 140 roughly, use some kind of quantification. So they are also simply quantified outputs and feedbacks and what have you at whatever non-global level. Enough for the summary, I guess. So then I asked for a lamp. I asked somebody to rub the lamp, so it would grant me 3 wishes. And that's why I keep it to 3. The summary is, we want to expand the use of methods, a first wish. Second wish, keep the matrix alive. There's been some discussion about it, but I do want to reinforce that. And 3, a number of ways in which we'd like to see new SSPs. Let me quickly go over some of that. So we had pre-conference discussions in focused meetings that we have with most of the authors of our subglobal session that unfortunately happened yesterday, so I can't invite you to go to it anymore. And most of it came out of that, so I'm not going to go over it. There's a lot. The focus is on the last word, etc. A lot of methodological issues passed by. The one thing I want to point out, though, and I find it quite remarkable, there are databases of co-production methods to do scenarios. And recently we published 140 techniques. I look at the 40 techniques, I look at what I see here, and they use 2. Okay? It's the stories and it's the models. And it's the models and it's the stories. And where are those 38 other ones? Why are we so poor on methodological use? And we really need more diversity. Even though I've seen quite a lot of diversity in the end, but we're really underusing the potential of methods that are out there. And I'll skip the rest, even though all of that is also relevant. You've seen this figure? And we want to keep the matrix alive. I was really happy with the RCP-SSP parallel process and the ramifications it had for a matrix and decoupling and what you could do with SSP-RCP combinations. But I think this is the figure I show to people. And this figure shows that the SSPs really have this dual purpose. On the one hand, they feed the integrated assessment models, and those produce emissions, and those go into the climate modeling, and that in the end feeds into the IVA community. But there's, on the other hand, the direct feed to the IVA community that sets the vulnerability and sets the whole context of how societies are changing and how they can cope with the same climate change impacts that will come to them. And that dual purpose is extremely confusing for people. So I'll tell you that right now there is another meeting going on. It's a kickoff meeting of a big project. And I've been told by the climate modelers in that project yesterday that I have to use SSP1, SSP2, SSP3, and SSP5. Because they're going to do climate downscaling for those 4. And I'm not allowed to develop SSP4 scenarios for my 6 case studies. And I find that worrying, because I can't convince the coordinator of that project, and he's not a stupid man, that there are 2 purposes and that there's no reason at all for me not to use SSP4. So it worries me that the matrix is disappearing and that people are converting back to the old SRS serial process, also because they find it easy. And it's sad for SSP4. And I think part of the reason of what you saw in the database, that the regional use of SSP4 is so low, is because of this disappearance of the matrix. There's other reasons, but I think this probably is one of them. So that's wish number 2. Wish number 3 comes also in 3 pieces. I don't see any red cards yet, so no, I'm fine, right? There you go. So what I would really like is the global community to support the use of globally implausible or even impossible combinations. Because if I do local studies in a local watershed somewhere in the northeast of the Netherlands, and I'm telling them that we can maximize climate change impacts, floods and other heat extremes, but we cannot assume maximum capability to deal with that because I can't do an SSP1 RCP 8.5 combination, then that's worrisome. Because something that's, it says here very unlikely, I think it's now termed impossible, but that's one of the most interesting combinations if I go to regional use. And it's inconsistent, I know, but we have to find some way to deal with that because many local case studies do need to have the possibility to do that without being lost for comparison reasons. All right? So I'm pissing off one person in the room now because I was not supposed to use this word. I went to 3 different sessions today. Very different topics. They all mentioned one thing, but we want from the current new generation of SSPs, we want them to be more realistic. And before, thank you, this is about the last point I'm going to make. So before I go into what the regional community wants, there's one warning. We do models, be it a mental model, be it a conceptual model, be it a mathematical model, or be it a global supercomputer model, to simplify reality. Okay, that's what we do here. And if we are going to make models that are going to be so complex that they actually mimic reality, well, then let's go out there. You know, why don't we just study reality? Then the models don't function anymore. So making them more realistic from all the angles that I've heard today that need to happen would be a wrong thing to do. But having said that, of course, they're right, so do all this. But what they're saying is mostly, I think the top point is the one that, no, the top and the bottom one. So the top one is, they find it very difficult to deal with SSP developments that are 80 years long, linear in the same direction. So particularly SSP5 is not palatable for most people. They have a revolution somewhere. People are rich and smart and they will still destroy the environment. No way. At some point that's going to backfire. So even if you don't see the impacts. So that's something they would like to see changed. And then the other thing, it struck me a little bit when we talk about complexity and how we deal with the complexity of systems, and how we then talk about including model links or better integrating or a feedback loop here or there. If I talk to the regional and local people, they would laugh. Because for us, complex systems mean that if I talk to people, they have different perspectives on what the future, so the future cone is there, that's what the SSPs are, but this is a very small part of the entire picture that you're looking at here. So we're talking about multiple pasts, we're talking about multiple presents, and we talk about multiple futures. And the more complex the system is, the more this is really an issue. We need talking to stakeholders that have a completely different understanding of the current system. So there's more than one current version, and therefore there's multiple cones that have to be thought through, because this is their reality and they're making decisions. Okay, so that's also part of making them more realistic. And I think the very last, but I'm not going to explain it even more, but please revive B2. We need something, the more local, adapting mosaic type of scenario that is sitting better with local and regional stakeholders. And I'll rest my case there. One question. Wow.
Well, we've got food and wine out here, so one question.
So thank you for this very informative presentation. So I just want, do you feel that is there any need to update the SSP which also incorporate the new technology like the carbon dioxide removal technologies and also the behavior of the people who would adopt these technologies? So do you feel that other than the regional or other than the spatial scale, so this scale must need to be addressed in these scenarios? Thank you.
Yeah, so I looked at all the scheme that Detlef put up yesterday of all the options we have to adapt the framework, and I would be all in favor to completely ditch the SSPs and start from scratch. If it would really be up to me. I mean, it's not very realistic to want that, but that would certainly include what you're saying. And I think technology is certainly an issue that's really missing. So to have more technology scenarios would be one of the low-hanging fruits that I would certainly tap into right away.
Thank you very much. I am going to suggest that we move on in the interest of drinks and dinner. Thank you very much, Casper. You know how to find him. And now we're going to hear a few remarks from Julia Leninger.
Yeah, thanks a lot. There's a... Mine's off, it should be okay. Perfect. Okay, yeah, good evening from my side. As Chris pointed out already, I'm pretty much aware that I'm in between this here and the dinner, but I invite you to take this as an appetizer for more conversations over dinner, and what I hope we can provide is one of the venues towards keeping the metrics alive, actually. So the title of my talk is "In What World Do We Want to Live In?" So during the last 2 days, the world we wanted to live in that I heard was a world where we fight climate change, where we counter the loss of biodiversity, and that is true. I agree on that, but for me there is a missing link, and the missing link is actually, and I heard that in some sessions as well, democracy. And of course, democracy is an intrinsic value, and it's probably easy for all of us to agree that we want our academic freedom. We don't want any government to violate our dignity. But for us in this community, there's another aspect that is really very important, and that is that democracy matters for the outcomes we are interested in. So democracy matters for climate change and so on. So I have 3 main messages for you here. Also, I have to click myself, right? Where do I point that to? Oh! Okay, so message 1 is democracy matters for sustainable development, including climate change, and we will show you 2 examples for that. The second message is that political science does offer theories that can inform scenarios and indicators that can serve for narratives and as inputs for integrated assessment models. And actually we measure those political and institutional developments with the VDEM data set, which is the largest of its kind. And I'm happy that Stefan Lindberg, who is the co-founder of VDEM and the director of the VDEM Institute, agreed to present this measurement. And my third message is integrating political institutions in IAMs is necessary, and after Kasper's talk, I would say is necessary to make scenarios more realistic. So we'll give you 2 examples, and I start with one, and then Stefan takes over, why democracy matters. So we just published a report together with UNDP where we look at interlinkages of SDGs, especially SDG 16 that covers political institutions, and SDG 10, equality, and SDG 1, reducing poverty. What we find is, and this is a literature review where we looked at about around 900 articles that look at that relationship. We screened those, etc. So method, you can look it up in the report. What we find is, and that's the important message here, is that, so on the left-hand side you find the input, the quality of the institutions. On the right-hand side you find SDG 1 and SDG 10, and in between there are some mechanisms. We could talk hours about this, but the important message here is the yellow ones, so the yellow flows that are thicker, provide us with the evidence that democratic institutions really matter to reach those goals. That's the first message, why democracy matters, and now I hand over to Stefan.
Thank you, and thanks for being invited to talk here today. Democracy matters. That was supposed to be a slide between. Okay, so this is, okay, democracy. So we're talking about political institutions, a set of political institutions that aggregate up either to democracy or autocracy, or versions thereof. A series of publications now in the journals that I don't publish in, so Nature and environmental research letters and so on, have shown that democracies are better at both committing to mitigate climate change, and that difference is pretty big. Different estimates, but up to minus 1.6 degrees with democracies versus autocracies. That's pretty significant, but also that democracies do better with implementing those commitments according to the Paris Accord on things that have to do with the air quality, or as in the graph here, carbon dioxide emissions reduction, right? So that's CO2 emissions per capita. And so I can easily sort of make a scenario of a world consisting of only autocracies, or close to only 90% autocracies, versus a world that's full of democracies, and that makes a big difference. Now, we'll say that in the last 20 years or so, the world has gone in that wrong direction. Here's a graph using the VDEM Liberal Democracy Index. This is the, you can see the world average in the middle. That's the black line with confidence intervals around it. All our measures have confidence intervals around it. And then different regions of the world. And they all go down pretty radically in the last few years. That started with Putin in Russia and Chavez in Venezuela around 2000. Now, this is the wrong presentation. We had a different one with long time series. So our data goes back for all countries in the world basically to 1900, but also for a selection of political units back to 1789. So if you want long time series to work with, you can do it. We can translate this data into this with democracies and autocracies. We do. So the same underlying data into autocracies, two types of autocracies, closed and electoral autocracies. Electoral autocracies, that's, so think Erdogan's Turkey, Putin's Russia, Duterte in the Philippines and so on. They hold multi-party elections, but the elections are not good enough, not free and fair enough, or media freedom and associational freedom, academic freedom is not good enough, so you don't qualify as a democracy. Now India have also slid into that category. If you put those two together, the electoral autocracies that are the most common regime type in the world today, and the closed dictatorships that are on an upward trajectory, we've gone from 49% of the world population to 70% of the world population living in autocracies in only the last 10 years. And you can imagine if these trajectories continue. So if you think back on that difference between democracies and autocracies and commitments on the Paris Accord, but also actual implementation, reducing CO2 emissions and so on. We have very strong theories for why that should happen. With the popular pressures, information about this threat of climate change, translating into popular pressures, and then a set of institutions that can make sure those pressures are translated into policy commitments and then implementation. That is not happening in autocracies, right? That's sort of the basic thrust of that. This is what VDEM sort of offers you. What I've shown you is at the top there with the different varieties of democracy, different indices. And then those are broken down to in indices of different aspects of democracy. And pay attention to one of them there, rule of law, which you will hear about soon, again, here from Julia. But what we're actually measuring is over 450 very, very specific aspects of democracy. From journalist harassment to women's freedom of speech and so on and so forth. We work with over 3,700 now academics and other experts from 180 countries to collect the raw data for this. So it's not myself or white men in their 50s like myself that decide how democratic Zimbabwe is, to put an example like that. All of this is available from the website, all the data, of course, but also the documentation and the methodology and all that. And on that note, let me hand it over to you, Julia, again, to continue.
Thanks. No.
Oh, no, okay.
No, it's fine, thanks. Okay, so why does that matter for integrated assessment models? So there's the following rationale. And I think we all agree that institutions governance is already in the scenario somehow. So there are drivers where in some papers implicitly or explicitly there's the argument that there's a high correlation between good quality institutions, for instance, GDP growth or education, so we have it there. Institutions, democracy, governance is very explicit in the narratives, in the SSPs especially. So SSP 4 contains democracy. They're a bit uneven. I know that the SHAPE project and my colleagues Ines and Ariel, who are here as well, are working for narratives to describe sustainable development pathways. And then very important for our argument here and what we saw on the slide with the climate policies is there are these models with the policy interventions, right? So what we know is, and the policy interventions are important, of course, but what we know and what we just saw is that political regimes and how societies are organized matters for policy content. So that's the rationale why we, and when I say we, I didn't introduce him, that's the work I do with my colleague Christopher Wingens and Konstantin Ruhe. Chris is here and will also speak tomorrow. So that's why we argue in our third message that there is a need to integrate political institutions in IAMs, and that's a kind of reality check we provide here. So what did we do? We look at political institutions measured by WIDEM, and we use the Equality Before the Law and Individual Liberty Index that contains indicators like accountability, political equality, participation. And we projected those along the SSPs and the SDPs. SDPs are the Sustainable Development Pathways. That's a Sustainable Development Pathway scenario developed, or it's a paper actually led by Björn Sörgel. You can find that on my portfolio in the IIASA Connect, so that's probably the easiest way how you learn about it. And you see that in that it's the upper curve, and the SDP and the SSP1, they merge, so it's only one line to avoid confusion. And as we set the target at 0.9, and whatever projection we look at, SSP1, 2, 3, SDP, 0.9 is not met. And one explanation can be seen here, which is, so we see SSP1, etc., is increasing, actually steeply increasing, improving. And the red line that you see here, that's the projection without the SSP. So that's the reality check, right? So if we, and this is data from 2019, so that's what has happened since 2019. And as we just heard, it's worsening. So, reality check. The bad news are it's not getting better when we look at SSP3, of course. So here it's a bit more realistic, but still far more positive than what we would expect without, when we contrast it with a projection without SSPs, right? So, having said this, let me get back to the three main messages. Democracy matters. We need to those indicators as inputs for IAMs. That would be really a new thing. And we need to integrate political institutions endogenously. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. Something I hadn't thought about, so I really appreciate all the work you did on that. We've got time for questions. Does anyone have? Who wants to be the first to ask a question? Somebody's taking a photograph. There's a question way in the back. And there's one over this way. K1, I can't see you, but thank you for pointing. So there's one in the back, and then we've got K1.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. I wanted to ask about the link between some of the democracies and some of the autocracies, and how that, if that complicates the picture. So, you know, the history of, for example, countries which presumably are on those democracies, like the UK and the US, you know, supporting and propping up countries like Saudi Arabia or Oman that presumably are on the list of autocracies, and whether the links between those and the dependence of one on the other potentially complicates the picture at all, or if you had any comments on that. Thanks.
Yeah, there are democracies that support autocracies in different ways, have strong economic interlinkages, military, for other strategically reasons, oil and so on in the past. Yes, definitely. But I also would like to point out that different from any other democracy measure out there, in our measures, the United States doesn't become sort of a good democracy until the early 1970s, after the civil rights movement. They had apartheid in the South, right? That's not very democratic, and so on. In that sense, there's also a lot of more variation in terms of how these countries that we often think of as old democracies actually behave on those measures. But beyond that, maybe I didn't hear everything.
It was really hard to hear. I couldn't.
So I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but I hope so.
Did that answer the question? Yes. Excellent. Thank you. And we've got a question for K1, and then we've got another hand way in the back. Am I missing anybody?
Yeah, so thank you very much for the presentations. I think obviously we are all concerned about the declining number of countries and declining number of democratic countries. Nevertheless, I'm wondering whether a government the effectiveness of a country to respond to certain environmental challenges is perhaps in most of the democratic countries higher, but in reality the determinant is a different one. Yeah? So if I think about, for example, the ability of many countries who have solved the air pollution problems in the past, many of them were not democratic countries, but they solved those problems actually a decade later than the early industrialized countries. And if you think about responses and implementation of policies like countries like China and how quickly and effective those are, I was wondering whether the level of democracy is the main determinant of whether you will be able to, let's say, decarbonize your society.
Well, it's of course never the main determinant, right? So there are many explanatory factors, but so government effectiveness is important. But for instance, I mean, you took an example. Let me take another example: COVID. We have no evidence that autocracies, on average, perform better than democracies. And I mean, this is not saying that. I mean, this is on average, right? So democracy, you compare democracies with autocracies, and they still perform better on the longer run. And another point here is, so if you look at two things: academic freedom, and as soon as you need innovation to tackle those problems, you might not be as effective in autocracies because innovation is much lower in autocracies. And second, if you look at civil society participation, you will need society to tackle climate problems and to pressure governments. And this is fading away, and there's evidence out there for that you need that civic space alongside government effectiveness. And then if we look at, I tend to say if autocracy is the solution, because we associate it with little tiny countries like Singapore that might have effective institutions, but if autocracy is the solution, then Africa would be a paradise, and we would get development aid from Africa, right? To just make a very simplistic case, or not a case, but a continent with a very high level of a lot of autocracies, right? So,
let me just add to that, if I may, Madam Chair. Yeah, so all these, it's an old discussion with government effectiveness, quality of government. I have the Quality of Government Institute next door in my department. But all of these studies now that are coming, it's a robust, long series of studies showing democracy's advantages. I highlighted climate change, economic growth, things like infant mortality, human health, disease, fighting diseases, and we can go down the line. And they all include, these are very robust studies, a lot of them with synthetic controls and all of that, all the bells and whistles you can throw at it, including government effectiveness. There's also, and the historical comparison is a little bit shaky because there were basically only autocracies then in that time period. But if you look at the time period after that, from 1900 and onwards, the story is different. And as Julia said, if you look at the history of autocracies, even if they have some government effectiveness, it's atrocious. As an autocracy, China and Singapore, they are exceptions among a very few. You're much more likely to end up like DRC, right? And even China, within China over time, it wasn't that good under Mao Zedong, right?
I can tell we're going to have really robust discussions over alcohol. I have somebody way in the back. I have somebody online. And then there was someone, was it Ed or somebody in the middle on the right? And then we now have 3 or 4 more hands. And we've got about 7 minutes. So we're going to start somebody way in the back's got a microphone.
Oh, hello.
Please go ahead. And then we'll go here to Boz.
I was just wondering how the VDEM codebook addresses differential treatment within countries based on ethnicity. For example, if I wanted to study the impact of racism and anti-racist measures upon emissions, would the VDEM codebook be a good source for that?
Yes and no. We don't have a specific measure for ethnicity for the reason that we have a measure for social group or several measures for social group variation within the country. For the reason that ethnicity is one type of variation historically and across the world. And in other countries, in other time periods, there are other social groups that matter rather than ethnicity, whether it's caste or caste and so on. So there is a bit imprecise set of measures that relates to that.
Boz from online.
Yeah, there are several online, but some of them actually already have been answered in other questions. But the one that sort of stands still is what mechanisms of democracy are then important for the environmental outcomes? Because especially if you look at how climate policy in the West took off very slowly, isn't that something the public discourse there to blame for that slow takeoff?
Well, you know this as much as I do. Yeah, I mean, so there and there's variation between democracies, both over time and cross-nationally, right? And there is variation among autocracies. But the sort of basic mechanism for these sort of the better outcomes for democracies in terms of producing public goods is that those who are making decisions are dependent on a large share of the population. And in order to satisfy us as citizens, or to some extent, or at least enough share to stay in power, on the assumption that political leaders want to stay in power, and political parties are there to hold power and exercise power. And then they, in theory, then should enact policies that we want and beneficial for us. And that's why there's that sort of also relationship with economic growth and there's electricity provision and then electricity consumption. There are other sort of public goods that are produced. And then you have the mechanism for that, which is, well, freedom of information, free media that can report about what people want and can tell people about the things they could have. And they also tell people about what the politicians actually do and the consequences of their decisions, and then with the electoral mechanism. So you can throw the rascals out and put somebody else in place. It's not perfect, and whether within countries over time, and there is variation, it's not perfect. But this sort of, that's sort of the basic tenets of the underlying theory, that in the longer run, they should produce better outcomes than sort of the non-treated group, right? The ones that didn't get the treatment of democracy. That's a short version.
This is great, thank you. We've got two people to my right side, a woman in a white blouse, and then about 5 rows in front, a man with a beard, and we'll take both of those questions.
Well, I didn't want to comment until on this, Julia mentioned that Africa would be paradise and China and Singapore would be on the exception. I think for scientific research, if something doesn't fit your conclusion, you cannot easily say that that is an exception. This is not convincing. So I totally agree with Kaiwan's argument that China indeed efficiently deal with the air pollution problem, but you summarize it as an exception, and we also see Singapore can efficiently deal with an environmental problem and environmental problems as well. So I don't think you can just summarize an exception, but I won't put more fire on this topic. I would give a more constructive suggestion, because we're doing, I'm from UTech University, but originally I'm a Chinese. So I used to use comparative perspective between the EU and China to compare both political systems' advantages and disadvantages. Therefore, our core argument in our interdisciplinary research, instead of focusing on democracy, we would focus on equity and equality, regardless of the political system. We all use it to take care of the vulnerable people and the vulnerable groups. And this can also decrease the sensitivity of the topic, especially when it's discussed in public. And another issue I want to mention is that actually political and the legal system can reflect on itself and adapt to environmental and societal changes. That is an inherent difference when we compare to biophysical system. Sea level cannot reflect on itself. I want to rise or I want to fall. It doesn't work. However, legal system can, political system as well. Therefore, when you take a political institution as an indicator, I would ask, do you take into account the adaptiveness and reflexivity of this system? If you take long-term time span until 2100, for example, because we do think this is a core issue and we take into account of this reflexivity of the system. Thank you.
We'll take one other question here on my right. if you could stand up and
Yeah,
ask your question.
I just want to change the topic if you allow me. So, yeah. So my question is for message 3, not the democracy and the autocracy. So as a new scientist, I just defend my PhD. So so we just work on a computer. And based on the theoretical and the data, and project some assumption or some scenarios in the future. So how would we integrate the political institutions? Because if I'm from the democratic country, so but the political institution is very hard to so they just focus on their 5-year plan. So they want to go back to the election. So how would what you suggest us? So what type of how we can convince them, or how we can endogenously incorporate in our study? I think if we want to incorporate, so we cannot do our research in timely or so this is my question. So I'm not for indulging in the very critical debate. Thank you.
Thank you. We have lots of questions. You see who the speakers are. There's lots of people who are looking longingly at the door. And so after the answer to these questions, we're going to thank the speakers all very much. And those who have more questions, I will invite up to ask the speakers. Okay?
So let me go first. Yeah, thanks for the third question. That's why I'm here, actually, because of the question how to integrate it into the model. So, but I will answer to the other one as well. Yeah, I mean, if we would know that, I would have presented something else, right? So the first thing is, it's really, I mean, I acknowledge that it's really difficult to integrate political factors, but I'm convinced we cannot do without it. So the first step that one can do already now is, without having it as an exogenous factor that influences the GDP, the drivers of the model, and so that is something we can think of at the moment. The second thing is, of course, to have a more systematic integration of those factors and concepts and theories in the narratives that describe the pathways. And then the third one, and the big question, is how to integrate it in the model as such, and what would be the theories as we saw. I mean, you gave one possible theory of change and mechanism. There are many mechanisms, right? And you would have to, and we have a lot of evidence for certain mechanisms, but you would have to see which one you take and which theory you take for that. And then the big question is whether how it would make sense to integrate it in the model. But it is something we should get started with that question. And I know that many of my colleagues and friends here are very suspicious whether we should really do that. My second point, yeah, I mean, I said exception with regard to Singapore, because it's like Rwanda, very small countries, and we could, of course, argue that every country in its own is exceptional, and we have to look at the context. But I think we do not help this debate if we look at China and in Singapore only. The variety is much higher and of countries. And just to speak a bit to what Kasper said as well, I don't think that we can assess this with big scenarios only, right? We have to complement this, and that's what our colleagues do as well at the IE. We have to look at case studies and see what are the mechanisms in the individual cases and regions. So it has to be a two-level perspective here. And with regard to equality and equity, yes, that's an option, of course. But the question is here, who is equal? Is it groups? I mean, we do have an international relation. I mean, countries influencing international law that goes towards group identity and not individual identity, so group rights versus individual rights. And here the question is, so what happens to the individual if it's all about group rights? So is it equal groups or is it equal individuals? And then who decides who are the groups who are equal? Because we know that in autocratic states, not all groups and members of certain groups have the same rights. So on the individual level, rights are very different. So I'm not so sure whether this really helps. And then the other thing, we are all on a shaky ground, right? Because what we know is that we don't get the data that we need from autocracies. There's no data transparency in autocracies. That's different in electoral autocracies. There might be more transparency, but the closed autocracies, it's really hard to tell.
Yeah, and yeah, I agree on most you say with regards to the cases and all that. But there, I mean, in a population of countries and over 120 years and so on, there's a central tendency that's very clear and all that, and then there are individual cases that for periods of time deviate from that pattern. That's the same when we look at anything else. Earlier, I mean, I've been in so many panels here at the Synergies Forum, there are always deviant cases, right? So that in itself is not a problem, I think, for that. And in the interest of time, I'll try and keep it short. But you're absolutely right about the reflexivity and that creates a measurement problem. That's a measurement problem we've taken very seriously to make sure that what we measure is measured by the same standard exactly for each one of these 400, I think it's 483 now, measures of different aspects of institutions across time and across space, right? So that they should be exactly comparable. And that's why we also come to have these measures. So on the Liberal Democracy Index, the United States was really crappy for a long time in the 20th century. So we try to do that. I'm sure it's not perfect. No measurement is perfect. Half of GDP is like, yeah, guesstimates. And now the economists will come and bash me. But so anyway, let me leave it at that, Madam Chair.
Have we end with a nicer note?
Yeah.
Like a more positive? Bright future.
A bright future is going ahead.
The barbecue, maybe.
The barbecue is waiting.
The barbecue is waiting,
associated
and Boz is going to come
parts.
up and say something positive about the future.
This one? Yeah. Few things positive about the future. One that tomorrow, look at your agendas again. We have shifted the afternoon program by half an hour earlier, cut the lunch break a little bit, so that you can leave half an hour earlier and catch many of your planes that you want to catch on. And then once we are done here, you have the barbecue dinner outside. Grill kind stuff is outside. Please also go inside to the oval room, because there are your salads and healthy stuff. And we don't want to feed you only grilled meat and vegetables. And then actually, beyond the speakers, I also would like to ask you to give a hand to the junior team that has been helping us out here today through this power outage and has kept everything running today, and is making a really long day today to make us here reach the end.